It's 1955 San Francisco. A quiet street, a modest apartment with red curtains. Inside, a man laughs nervously as a woman pours him a drink. He doesn't know there's LSD in it. He doesn't know that, behind the mirror, another man is watching him, taking notes, whispering into a recorder, fascinated by what happens when human consciousness is stripped of control. The man behind the glass isn't a criminal. He works for the CIA. And this isn't a party. It's an experiment called Operation Midnight Climax. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you love stories about real spy operations that shape the world from the shadows, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next mission from Spy Shadows. Give this video a like and share it with someone who loves true spy videos. The Cold War wasn't fought only with missiles and spies. It was fought in the mind. In the early 1950s, paranoia consumed Washington. The Korean War had ended, but the psychological scars of captured American soldiers confessing on camera to crimes they never committed sent shockwaves through the US intelligence community. To the CIA, it looked like something beyond torture: mind control. A terrifying idea began to spread through Langley. What if the Soviets had discovered a way to control human thought? What if they could turn loyal men into traitors? So began one of the darkest and most secret programs in US history, Project MK-Ultra. It wasn't about gathering information. It was about breaking the human mind apart, then learning how to rebuild it. Inside this sprawling project were dozens of subprograms, each testing different psychological and chemical techniques. Some focused on hypnosis, others on sleep deprivation. But one branch wanted to explore the potential of a new, mysterious chemical: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. In the early 1950s, LSD was still largely unknown. Some scientists believed it could unlock the subconscious. The CIA saw something far darker: a tool to extract secrets, erase memories, or even reprogram loyalty. To test it, they needed human subjects. But not the kind who volunteered. At the center of this experiment was a man named George Hunter White. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a psychologist. He was a former Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, a man known for his brutality, manipulation, and flair for the bizarre. To the CIA, he was perfect. White was used to dealing with criminals, addicts, and the underworld. He had no moral hesitation, and even less oversight. In 1954, under the orders of Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who directed MK-Ultra, White was given a mission: set up safehouses in American cities. Lure unsuspecting individuals inside, dose them with LSD, and observe what happens. The plan was grotesque but simple. The CIA would fund fake apartments in San Francisco and New York, disguised as ordinary brothels. CIA-paid sex workers would bring in men, promising an evening of pleasure. Behind the wall, hidden microphones and cameras recorded everything. The agents called it Operation Midnight Climax. White's first safe house was located in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like an average apartment, dimly lit, furnished with cheap decor and a stocked bar. But behind the scenes, it was wired with two-way mirrors, recording equipment, and listening devices. The prostitutes, trained by CIA handlers, would slip doses of LSD into their clients' drinks. Once the drug took effect, agents would watch from behind the mirror, observing every reaction: how people spoke, how they confessed, how they behaved when their mind slipped from control. To them, it was science. To the victims, it was a nightmare they never remembered. George Hunter White often bragged in his personal notes about the bizarre things he witnessed. He described himself as both observer and participant, a voyeur in the name of national security, His diary, discovered decades later, revealed chilling words. "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." These were not words of regret. They were the confessions of a man who had found pleasure in manipulation. White reported back to CIA headquarters with enthusiasm. He wrote that LSD loosened tongues, that it made subjects susceptible, that it could possibly be used in interrogations or psychological conditioning. But the truth was murkier. No consistent results were recorded. Many subjects simply panicked, hallucinated, or broke down emotionally. Still, Langley kept funding the project. Because in the Cold War, ethics didn't matter. Winning did. Soon, more safehouses appeared, each one decorated like a strange mix of bordello and surveillance lab. The agents filled them with exotic artwork, alcohol, and hidden cameras. CIA officials watched live feeds from these secret rooms while drinking martinis, joking about their field tests. The irony was haunting. A government agency sworn to protect its citizens was now secretly experimenting on them. There were no waivers, no consent forms, no safeguards. The test subjects were ordinary men, sailors, drifters, and businessmen, none of whom ever knew they'd been drugged by their own government. Meanwhile, at Langley, Sidney Gottlieb pushed for broader experimentation. If LSD could weaken the mind, perhaps it could also reshape it. Soon, MK Ultra expanded beyond Midnight Climax. Hospitals, universities, and even prisons were drawn into the web, sometimes unknowingly. Doctors and researchers were given CIA funding to test hallucinogens, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation, often without their patients' informed consent. It was science without ethics, patriotism without humanity. And through it all, the safehouses continued to operate. White kept detailed records, lists of test nights, dosage levels, and behavior patterns. He wrote about the subjects who cried, screamed, or begged for clarity as reality dissolved around them. To him, it was data. To history, it was evidence of one of the darkest violations of human rights ever sanctioned by the US government. The CIA justified it all under one phrase: national security. If the Soviets were experimenting with brainwashing, America had to be ready. And if innocent people had to suffer for that knowledge, it was, in their words, a necessary cost. But what began as paranoia soon turned into obsession. The agency was no longer just trying to defend itself. It was trying to control the uncontrollable, the human mind. By the end of the decade, the lines between science and sadism had blurred completely. Agents no longer cared about data accuracy. They cared about domination, about testing limits, about seeing how far they could go before the mind broke. And in those shadowy rooms, where mirrors hid men with notebooks and cameras, America's moral compass quietly shattered. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just a program. It was a warning. A glimpse of what happens when secrecy and power go unchecked, when fear justifies anything. But the walls would not stay silent forever. Soon, whispers of the operation would start leaking. Files would disappear. Witnesses would vanish. And the truth would face its most dangerous enemy. The agency that created it. The cover-up was about to begin. The mirror was clean, so clean you'd never know it hid another world behind it. A man would walk into the room, laughing, nervous, unaware. He'd sit on a red velvet couch, sip a drink, and feel the warmth spread through him. Then his laughter would twist, his hands would tremble, the walls would ripple, and on the other side of the glass, a CIA operative would lean closer, taking notes as the man's reality dissolved. This was Operation Midnight Climax, and behind that mirror, America's shadow government watched its own citizens lose their minds. The safehouses didn't look like laboratories. They looked like dens of sin. That was the point. George Hunter White knew that when desire entered the room, reason left. He decorated his San Francisco and New York safehouses to feel like a dream, or a trap, depending on which side of the mirror you stood. The rooms glowed with dim, seductive light. A stocked bar stood in the corner. The air smelled faintly of perfume and cigarettes. A painting hung crookedly on one wall, hiding a microphone behind the frame. And above the bed, a mirror. One that didn't just reflect, it watched. From behind it, White and his colleagues could see everything. They'd sit there for hours, drinking, joking, taking notes as unsuspecting men, often sailors, drifters, or low-level criminals, wandered into the web. Their partners, women paid by the CIA, were not told the full truth. They thought it was part of research for the government. They were instructed to lure men inside, offer them drinks, and ensure they stayed long enough for observation. The drinks, of course, were spiked with LSD. The victims never consented. They never even knew. Their confusion, panic, and breakdowns were all recorded as data. Some cried. Some laughed hysterically. Some begged for help, believing they were dying or losing their minds. White would observe every reaction with fascination. In his notes, he called them subjects. In reality, they were human beings, experimented upon by their own government in the name of intelligence. Inside the CIA's MK-Ultra division, these safehouses were referred to as field testing sites. Reports were filed using code numbers and vague terms, never names. Everything was designed to protect the agency, not the subjects. One memo described the purpose as evaluating behavioral changes under controlled conditions. But there was nothing controlled about it. The victims were strangers, chosen at random. Their dosage levels varied. Their mental states were unknown. The only constant was the mirror, and the man behind it. George Hunter White took pride in his work. He'd been involved in narcotics enforcement since the 1930s, working for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics before joining the CIA. He'd hunted smugglers, spies, and foreign agents. But in his personal writings, he admitted that Midnight Climax was something different. He described it as a chance to explore human behavior in its rawest form. He was not experimenting for science. He was satisfying curiosity, his own and that of the men above him. One of those men was Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist behind MK-Ultra. A quiet, deeply private man, Gottlieb had convinced the CIA that the key to Cold War dominance wasn't just weapons, it was mind control. If the US could learn to manipulate the human mind, they could create perfect spies, extract secrets, or destroy enemies without firing a shot. LSD became his obsession. He called it the most promising chemical ever discovered. And Midnight Climax was his way of seeing how far it could go. Through George White, Gottlieb's vision became a disturbing reality. In memos and field reports, White's experiments were described as behavioral influence sessions. In truth, they were nights of chaos. Some subjects would become euphoric, laughing uncontrollably, confessing secrets they'd never told anyone. Others would panic, screaming, hallucinating, or curling into the corner, terrified by visions no one else could see. Behind the mirror, the agents observed in silence. They took notes. They recorded audio. They sometimes even filmed. Every reaction, every breakdown, was analyzed later at Langley as data. But no consistent pattern ever emerged. LSD didn't act the same way twice. One dose could make a man sing, another could drive him insane. Still, the CIA refused to stop. If something could control the mind, they wanted to find it, even if they had to destroy countless minds to get there. By 1957, the operation expanded. New safe houses were established in Marin County, California, and Greenwich Village, New York. The CIA used shell companies to pay rent and utilities. Every trace of connection to the government was erased. Inside, the environment was refined for research purposes. New hidden cameras replaced older microphones. Agents experimented with lighting, music, and conversation techniques. Some tried to manipulate subjects verbally while they were under the influence, testing how far they could push behavior. It was a laboratory of manipulation, and George White ran it like a theater. He was known for wearing flashy clothes, smoking cigars, and speaking like a detective from a pulp novel. He'd entertain guests, sometimes friends from law enforcement, by showing them recordings of sessions. It became a grotesque form of entertainment for men who believed secrecy made them untouchable. But beneath the jokes and whiskey, there was unease. Some CIA officials began questioning what these operations were achieving. The results were erratic. No one could predict how LSD affected a person, or if it could be weaponized at all. Yet Gottlieb pressed on. He believed they were close to unlocking something powerful. The official objective remained the same: to find a drug or technique capable of controlling human consciousness. Behind closed doors, the CIA discussed possibilities: creating assassins who could kill without memory, prisoners who would confess on command, or agents who could resist brainwashing. It all seemed possible, if they just found the right formula. Operation Midnight Climax was their testing ground, but instead of producing breakthroughs, it produced paranoia. Agents began to fear being dosed themselves. Rumors spread through the CIA about people seeing hallucinations in the office or forgetting entire nights after a test. The project that sought to control minds was slowly losing control of its own. And outside those secret walls, society had no idea. No one suspected that the government was experimenting with hallucinogens on civilians. To the public, LSD was an obscure chemical known only to chemists and psychiatrists. But that was about to change, because as the 1960s approached, LSD escaped the shadows. What began in a CIA safehouse would soon flood the streets, changing culture, music, and consciousness forever. The mirror's reflection was spreading, and the men who once hid behind it were losing their grip on the experiment they started. The file was stamped top secret, and for years it stayed that way. Tucked deep inside a vault at Langley, it held the details of a nightmare hidden behind two-way mirrors. But secrets, no matter how tightly sealed, have a way of leaking. By the early 1960s, the same chemical the CIA had once treated as classified was now spreading through America's counterculture. LSD had escaped the shadows, and it was no longer the agency's secret weapon. The leak didn't come from a spy or a defector. It came from the scientists themselves. Researchers once quietly funded by the CIA, under front organizations and shell grants, had begun sharing their findings publicly. Universities like Stanford and Harvard conducted their own LSD experiments. And one man, Timothy Leary, would turn the same substance used in secret interrogations into a symbol of freedom, while Leary told the public to turn on, tune in, and drop out. The CIA watched in disbelief. The very drug they had hoped to control was now controlling society itself. From covert tool to cultural revolution, LSD had escaped their grasp. Inside the agency, this was not enlightenment, it was exposure. By 1963, the CIA's own internal structure was cracking. George Hunter White's operations were getting sloppy. Neighbors began complaining about strange visitors and constant activity in the San Francisco safehouse. Local police, unaware of the operation's nature, began asking questions. White tried to brush them off with his usual charm and forged paperwork, but suspicion lingered. Worse, some of his subjects had started talking. A few men claimed they'd been drugged during encounters they didn't understand. Others spoke of hallucinations so vivid they feared they were losing their sanity. The agency's secrecy was at risk, but instead of shutting it down immediately, Langley doubled down. They ordered White to refine his procedures, use smaller doses, and minimize attention. They even expanded some activities to the East Coast, where anonymity was easier to maintain. But control was slipping. Meanwhile, within the CIA's Technical Services Division, Sidney Gottlieb faced growing criticism. Some questioned whether the MK-Ultra project had produced any usable results after years of funding and hundreds of experiments. Millions of dollars had been spent on LSD tests, hypnosis sessions, electroshock trials, and even mind control research involving sensory deprivation and isolation chambers. But no weapon had emerged. No truth serum. No perfect assassin. Just chaos. A few field officers warned that the continued use of civilians, without consent, was crossing a moral and legal line. But in the Cold War atmosphere, morality was a luxury few entertained. Every unethical experiment was justified under one phrase: national security. Gottlieb defended his work fiercely. He argued that the Soviets were conducting similar experiments, possibly using their own citizens as test subjects. He insisted that stopping MK-Ultra would be strategy blindness. And so, the experiments continued, quietly and increasingly out of control. Then came the break that shattered the illusion of secrecy. In 1973, amid the growing scandal of Watergate, the CIA faced new internal audits. Director Richard Helms, fearing exposure, ordered the destruction of all MK-Ultra files. Thousands of pages, detailing years of human experimentation, were shredded. Helms believed that by burning the evidence, the agency would bury the truth forever. But not everything burned. Some records survived, misfiled, forgotten, or duplicated elsewhere. And a few people who knew the truth refused to stay silent. One of them was John Marks, a journalist and former State Department official who began piecing together fragments of what happened. Through declassified documents, congressional leaks, and testimonies, he reconstructed the story of Midnight Climax, brick by brick, horror by horror. Public outrage ignited when the Church Committee hearings began in 1975. The Senate Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, was tasked with investigating abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies. Among the witnesses was a man who described secret drugging experiments conducted in CIA safehouses. The senators listened in disbelief as he spoke of prostitutes on the agency's payroll, LSD-spiked drinks, and men being filmed through hidden mirrors. It sounded like fiction. But it wasn't. It was America's own government, using its citizens as unwilling subjects in psychological warfare. Declassified documents painted a disturbing picture. The CIA's obsession with mind control had led it to cross nearly every ethical boundary imaginable. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't just a side project. It was part of a systematic pattern of abuse that stretched across prisons, hospitals, universities, and even military bases. The press seized on the story. Headlines around the country screamed, CIA drugged Americans in secret tests. Sex, spies, and LSD, the Midnight Experiments. For the first time, the American public realized how deep the surveillance state truly ran. It wasn't just foreign spies under observation. It was them. Behind closed doors, panic spread through Langley. Retired officers were questioned. Files were subpoenaed. And though most evidence had been destroyed, enough fragments remained to reveal the truth. George Hunter White was called in for testimony, but by then he was retired and defiant. He claimed he had served his country faithfully and showed no remorse. When asked about his safe houses, he simply said, "I was a soldier. I followed orders." The hearings didn't lead to prison sentences or full accountability, but they changed public trust forever. For the first time, Americans saw the dark side of the agencies that claimed to protect them. The CIA's carefully crafted image as defenders of freedom cracked, and what spilled out was disturbing. Congress passed new regulations. The CIA's human experimentation programs were supposedly terminated. and new oversight committees were formed to prevent future abuses. But inside the agency, many believed it was just the surface being cleaned. The deeper machinery, the culture of secrecy and psychological manipulation, remained untouched. Outside the intelligence world, LSD had already changed history in its own way. From a covert chemical weapon to a symbol of rebellion, it had slipped from government control and taken root in art, music, and philosophy. The very substance once tested in silence became a global conversation about consciousness, ethics, and control. But behind that cultural awakening was a shadow most people never saw. A shadow that began with a mirror and a man writing in a notebook while others screamed behind glass. Operation Midnight Climax had ended, but its echoes remained. In the corridors of intelligence agencies, it was remembered as a misstep. To the victims, it was something else entirely, a wound that never healed. And yet, buried within that chaos, the question remained unanswered. Did the CIA truly stop experimenting on its own people? Or did it simply find new ways to hide? The rooms were emptied long ago, the mirrors taken down, the bar shelves cleared of bottles that once hid invisible poison. But even now, decades later, the ghost of those rooms lingers. Not in the walls of San Francisco or New York, but in the quiet corridors of power, where secrecy is the air they breathe. Operation Midnight Climax was never about the brothels, not really. It was about control, the illusion that the mind could be owned, bent, and weaponized. And though the CIA abandoned its LSD experiments publicly, the philosophy that created them never disappeared. It simply evolved. In the years after the Church Committee hearings, America entered a new age of transparency. Or so it seemed. The CIA faced intense scrutiny, the press called for reforms, and the government promised oversight. But the agency's internal culture, one built on plausible deniability, didn't dissolve overnight. Some of the men involved in MK Ultra quietly retired. Others transferred to newer divisions under different names: behavioral research, information influence, psychological operations. Different titles, same intention. Behind the scenes, funding streams continued through the Department of Defense, academic grants, and private contractors. The tools of control changed from LSD and hypnosis to data, media, and surveillance. The mind, after all, could be shaped not only by chemicals, but by information. By the 1980s, the agency's focus had shifted to digital networks and psychological profiling. Instead of dosing individuals, it learned to dose societies with narratives, images, and carefully chosen truths. The same principle that guided MK Ultra's experiments, influence without consent, found a new stage in the emerging age of information warfare. The mind was still the battlefield. Only the weapons had evolved. Some analysts argue that Operation Midnight Climax was the prototype for a new kind of warfare. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with stories and screens. It was no longer necessary to drug a man to make him question reality. All it took was the right image, the right message, at the right time. The mirror had moved from a hidden wall in a safe house to every glowing screen in the modern world, but the shadow of the past occasionally surfaced. In the 1990s, survivors of MK Ultra and its subprojects filed lawsuits against the US government, demanding acknowledgement and compensation. Most were dismissed or settled quietly, often without admission of guilt. The victims were left with fractured memories, unanswered questions, and a haunting realization. Their government had treated them as expendable. Declassified documents later revealed even more disturbing details about tests on prisoners, hospital patients, and military personnel. Some experiments had been carried out in allied nations under cooperative agreements, spreading the reach of MK Ultra far beyond American borders. The world began to see that Midnight Climax wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. Inside Langley, the story of Midnight Climax became a lesson in what not to get caught doing, not what not to do. Young recruits were told the tales as cautionary history, stripped of moral context. The agency's own review described it as a failure in operational discipline, never as a moral catastrophe. Even after its exposure, the CIA continued to explore behavioral science. But now, the testing grounds weren't bars or bedrooms. They were databases and online networks. Where the old spies watched from behind glass, the new ones watched from behind firewalls. Psychological manipulation became algorithmic, surveillance became invisible, and just as before, consent was rarely part of the process. In recent years, declassified documents and investigative journalism have revived interest in Midnight Climax and its connection to modern practices. Intelligence experts point out that many of today's social and political influence campaigns, both foreign and domestic, mirror the same core principle: control perception to control behavior. Only now, it's not one man being drugged in a hidden room. It's millions being influenced in plain sight. Midnight Climax may have ended in the 1960s, but its echo continues. In every experiment that tests human behavior without permission, in every policy that values secrecy over transparency, and in every system that treats truth as something to be engineered. Still, there were those inside the intelligence community who carried the weight of what had happened. Some of the field agents who assisted in MKUltra's subprojects later confessed deep regret. They had followed orders, believing they were serving their country. But when the veil lifted, they saw something different. Not defense, but desecration. A few spoke privately to journalists and historians, describing what it felt like to watch lives unravel for the sake of science and fear. Their testimonies gave voice to what official reports never could. That behind the bureaucratic language of behavioral modification were broken people, lives scarred by experiments they never agreed to. The story of Operation Midnight Climax isn't about science. It's about power and how far institutions will go when they believe secrecy makes them righteous. It's a story of fear disguised as research and control disguised as protection. The mirrors are gone, but the questions they reflected still remain. Who watches in the name of safety? Who decides what's acceptable when the public isn't allowed to know? And what happens when the desire to control others becomes stronger than the responsibility to understand them? As the camera fades, the image returns to that small apartment in San Francisco. The walls are quiet now. The chair is empty. The mirror reflects only dust and sunlight. But for those who know what happened there, it's not just a piece of history. It's a warning, one that every generation must remember. Because the next Midnight Climax might not use drugs at all. It might use data. It might use fear. And it might already be happening. If you thought Operation Midnight Climax was chilling, wait until you watch the next one. Subscribe to Spy Shadows and stay with us as we uncover the next mission they never wanted you to hear about.